I'm here with Richard Black, who is from Strength to Strength. And Richard, you have done a lot of work working with churches, and obviously leaders of churches answer a call from God to lead in a spiritual sense, but they often find themselves leading in an organisational sense. Do you want to tell me about that juxtaposition?
Yeah, sure. What we find is that when church leaders respond to the call, there is something on their heart to see the lost saved, to see the community changed. They have what we would call as a calling to be spiritual leaders. But then when they hit the concrete aspects of the role, so how many attended on Sunday, what's our income level like, what's our OSH, how's our building program going, then what happens is that puts pressure on the church leader, and they shift from being the spiritual leader to being an organisational leader. And their role is always going to have an organisational component, but it becomes the tail that wags the dog. And in fact, they lose part of their calling as they become far more immersed in over-identifying with the role.
Is that why church leaders find themselves struggling so much, and you often hear about church leaders who just really spend time often wanting to quit and wanting to give up?
Yeah, well, it's certainly one of the factors in it. And one of those key aspects that happens is that the leader merges their sense of who they are in Christ, what their calling is, with the role itself. And so they over-identify with the role. So if the role is supposedly succeeding, whatever that means to them, they are a success. If the role isn't, well, then at times they feel defeated, they feel like all their efforts have come to nothing. Rather than being able to step back from the role and step back into their calling to go, actually, whether I'm at this church or in this setting or anywhere else, what is it that God's put in my heart that I just bleed for, that stirs me? And it's not until they can separate the core of who they are, their calling, from the role, that they begin to get more emotional resilience and well-being back.
Is it fair that we place that expectation on our church leaders to also be chief executives of sometimes rather large organisations?
Yeah, it's really hard, because at times I don't necessarily know if we place it, if many church leaders aspire to that. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, it just happens. And we can look into the business world and say, so that's what growing a successful organisation looks like, so therefore you need to be that. Or the church leader may think, in order to be a success, I need to be like a CEO. And we actually lose the spiritual calling and the spiritual component from it. So sometimes it is intentional, sometimes it's certainly unintentional, but we have to become aware of it to create health again.
So what can church leaders look for or be aware of, at least to start a journey of ensuring that they're emotionally resilient for the long term?
Well, there are a number of factors with that one, but I work with church leaders to, first of all, let's form up their identity in Christ. Not at just some theological level, but at a real level. Who am I? And are there unmet needs in me? Is there unfinished business? Because if we haven't addressed our unfinished business, we lead out of that and we spiritualize it, whereas that actually becomes quite detrimental. So first of all, let's deal with any unfinished business. And the second thing is, let's get really clear about what God has placed in your heart, what He's calling you to, and then let's separate that out from the role, so that church leaders recognize if the role succeeds or fails, if I even got fired from this role, my calling goes nowhere, and that's where I want to be. So when they can minister out of who they are in Christ, minister towards their calling, and also minister in accordance with their role, there's greater resilience. There are a number of other factors, but another key one would be around being vulnerable, wisely vulnerable, being real, being authentic. If you're continually pretending, or you're continually having to put a mask where you look like you've got no cracks, that's emotionally exhausting. But when you can just be a human with other humans, then that creates a greater sense of well-being.
So where would a church leader go if they are at their wits' end and they perhaps have never thought of this, or perhaps they're just finding that kind of joining together of their role and their sense of self just a bit too overwhelming? Where would someone go to find help?
Sure. Well, I mean, they can contact me, they can contact our team at Strength to Strength. They could be a part of one of the Strength and Leader courses that we run, which is about developing mental and emotional resilience within the church leader. And even if those are aspects that aren't suitable for them, we'd be happy to point them in the right direction.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, for being here with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks.